Hello, everyone. It's going to be my pleasure today to introduce the link simulation to you. I've used the link simulation now for over 40 different classes that I've been involved in. And every time I do, I learn something new about the simulation, and I see a new strategy that a team will deploy and be quite successful. And I've seen other teams that have struggled. And I'm hoping that with this class, we're going to have lots of different success as you roll through this particular simulation. Now, why do we use simulations? Simulations are really a way for us to take what is a representation of reality, in this case an end-to-end supply chain, and it enables us to do testing on various different factors and elements to see what happens in an environment where we have lots of variation and variability, and to determine, as a supply chain manager, what is going to be the best course of action. In this particular simulation, your team or firm is in a high-tech business, and you're manufacturing this product called a set-top box. Now, that's just a very generic name for a product that really has a lot of different uses. And in fact, I suspect you have a set-top box in your home as well. And it would be things like, I'm doing this recording on Zoom and I'm going to upload it to YouTube, but I'm not attached to the direct computer link coming into our house because I have a wireless router. That's an example of a set-top box. Another example would be the cable box that we have that allows us to do a lot of high-definition streaming. In businesses, it might be something that allows them to do video conferencing. They might use it as well in terms of that if they have a product support, for example, if they're a technical firm, if they have software that would allow them to have that product support across the globe, and they would do that internet calling on the basis of an internet itself. If you're not familiar with what a set-top box is, please, by all means, do a Google search and just do what is a set-top box, and fairly quickly you'll have a better idea of what it is. Your particular company is going to manage or manufacture two different types of set-top boxes. Those two products are hyperware and metaware. And those two products have similar raw materials, and they have a similar subassembly. In terms of raw materials, they both have two raw materials, one that's alpha, one that's beta. And if you've looked at the manual for the link simulation, you'll know that those products are fairly commonly available. They're what we would refer to as a commodity. They both share a subassembly that's called an epsilon. Now, you're probably not going to remember a lot of this, but one of the things about epsilon that's so critical is the fact that unlike the other subassemblies and unlike the raw materials, alpha and beta, epsilon has a 1-month lag time. So we have to plan very carefully to make sure that we have enough of that on hand. Hyperware and metaware also have a distinct subassembly. They have a delta and a gamma that are unique to each of those. And they need different portions of the alpha and beta in terms of making them. And we'll talk a little bit about where you can find the recipe or the bill of materials for these two products a bit later. You sell these two products through two channels, one of which is direct to consumer. So if you're technology savvy, like I know a lot of you are, you would probably just simply go online, do some price comparison and order from a vendor that would have a price and availability that would suit your requirements. Now, if you're like me, and you know I can be challenged when it relates to technology, I'd probably go to a Best Buy or maybe to a Target or someplace like that that's going to have somebody, particularly the Best Buy, that's going to be very knowledgeable about these types of products. And they would walk me through, what my needs are. For example, where is that router going to be housed? Where am I going to use my laptop? All of those kinds of things. And so they would help me get one. So you're going to sell through both of these channels. And as you know, they're going to have very different requirements. We sell those products in 3 different regions. We sell them in the U.S., which is where we also manufacture the product. We have a distribution center there. We also have a region including Europe and the Pacific, where we also distribute and sell these two types of product. Let's take a look at what that would look like in terms of this schematic. Now, let's see if we can take it apart into the 3 different pieces that it is. You'll notice that on This side, the region 1, it's exactly as I described it. The distribution center that's adjacent to the manufacturing plant. We're going to sell to the two markets, or through the two channels that we talked about, the retailers, and then we also sell direct to customers. Now, what's choices that you have in terms of your strategy is that you can determine for Europe and then also for the Pacific, do I want to have a presence, and a presence being a distribution center and perhaps some light manufacturing or assembly there, or do I want to just ship direct from my manufacturing facility and my distribution center in the US? That's what this middle piece looks like. We don't have a distribution center there. The other choice that you will have relative to Europe and to the Pacific is that you can decide for either both or one of those regions that we want a physical presence there. And when you look at the manual for links, you'll determine that there are advantages and disadvantages to that. It's all going to be about the strategy that you're going to deploy for your firm that will determine what your supply chain structure looks like. And we've talked about this a lot already. We spent a big portion of the course talking about the fact that once we determine what our physical nodes are, and we've determined the links between them, we can adjust, modes of transportation, how we'd like to ship things. But that can end up establishing or determining 80% of our costs. So think carefully about what your strategy is relative to your Europe and your Pacific markets in terms of how you want to approach those particular markets themselves. Now, the simulation is a really good one because it allows us to cover really a variety of decision areas that's going to give us the ability to determine as a team, what are you going to look like as a supply chain manager in this end-to-end kind of environment? Now, what would happen in most of our careers is that we would take that job when we finish this program, and we would manage either something like the distribution and warehousing. We might be in charge of transportation. We might go into a procurement role. But this simulation gives us the ability to manage almost all of that. And so you'll be making decisions starting with, and it'll include forecasting, which if you think about that, that's where it all starts. We have to figure out how much are we going to sell of both of those products in both of those regions. And then we have to break it down from there into a more disaggregate form. Once we know how much we want to sell, then we are also able at that point to schedule two important things. We can determine how much we need to manufacture based on how much we might have in inventory of that particular product already in terms of finished good. And if we know what we need to make once we determine what's in inventory, or if there's anything in inventory, then we'll need to order the rest of the raw materials and the sub-assemblies that are going to be a part of helping us meet that overall number that we've decided are going to be the total for all three of our markets for both of those products themselves. Now, distribution and warehousing, however, will be one of those decisions that when we talked about in the previous slide, that when you decide I'm going to have a distribution center there or I'm going to ship direct, a lot of this will be determined when that becomes available in terms of our phased-in decision-making. And I don't mean to be vague about that, but when we start talking about the phased-in decisions, I'll talk a little bit more about that. On an ongoing basis, you will be scheduling that transportation to the various markets. And that will be, as I said, every decision period, every month, you'll be making choices about whether we want to send it by air or whether we're going to send it by surface carriers, surface including the ocean itself. And the only distinguishing portion there would be that air and surface being not only the ocean, but it would be any motor carrier component or other modes that we would need for that. You'll have a host of carriers that you can choose from. Once again, if you've looked at the manual, which I hope you have, you'll see that there's a wide array of carriers that you can use for those two modal choices. And there's a variety of quality of services as well as costs that go along with that. That same is going to be true for the suppliers and vendors that you have on the procurement side in terms of raw materials as well as those sub-assemblies. One of the phased-in decisions is going to include service. As you well know, that can be very impactful because customers buy not only the core product, but they also buy from us that bundle of services. And so you'll need to make a decision about whether or not you want to have kind of a standard one, which would be like we typically get if we call to check, for example, on some financial services like banking, and it's a very provider routed menu, and it would say something like, for customer service, press 1, for, to check your balance, press 2, all the way up to if I called perhaps my financial advisor who's helping me plan for my future, I would expect if I call, I'm going to get that person on the phone. And the costs really have a wide array as well, depending on how hands-on or how much we not provider routed, but are going to be very customer specific itself. And then last but not least, where we have a lot of fun with the link simulation, is that you have the ability to see what happens when we introduce two different elements in terms of the 4P model. So generate demand is a way of looking at what happens when we can do promotions. You'll have advertising dollars that you can use, as well as the other P that we're going to let you experiment with in the simulation, which is price. You have the ability to both increase as well as decrease price. And I think I'd said before, I've yet in all the 40 different times that I've executed this simulation, I've yet to have a time where we actually had a team or an industry that did not have a price war that was started. I think it's just the nature of how we compete in the marketplace. And so I think that this time around, again, that we'll also use that price mechanism and generate demand to have some very interesting results. So what's the goal? The goal here is for you to really improve your firm's performance over time. You inherited this firm. It's been running for 3 months. Your first decision will be about month 4. You will find that across both industries as well as all of our teams, everybody is almost in what we consider to be an identical position as it relates to, that statistics portion of it. While your numbers might be slightly different, they are not statistically significantly different. And so we are starting at the same component that gives us the ability over time in these decision periods to determine, how effectively and how efficiently you're managing this supply chain. And we'll talk a little bit about the metrics in just a few slides later in this presentation. There are 14 different metrics for which, with every decision period, I'm provided with a score that tells me how well your team did in this process. You have to work as a team. The workload is much too heavy for just one person to make all of the decisions. And I find that the more effective the team is, the better the results are going to be overall. Now, if you're like me and you kind of like thinking about things from a process standpoint, then we talk about it from inputs, and then we would talk about it from an output standpoint. So we have customer-facing decisions. Those might include things that we talked about in terms of the service. How are we going to use those to make sure that in addition to a product and the strategy we want to have, and I'll pause just a little bit here to talk about those customer-facing decisions, not only just that attribute of service, but the core product itself. One of the major decisions I think you're going to need to make as a firm is what, your strategy. And I like to use some fairly simple examples. You might want to decide, are we going to take a Walmart approach? Are we going to be about an everyday low price? And I think that how we execute that particular strategy means that we're always very, very cost conscious in every single area. So all of these inputs are going to be viewed through that particular lens. Now, at the other end of that spectrum, we might decide that we're going to be a Neiman Marcus. And many of you know that Neiman Marcus is really known for really high touch, high service. And with that, we would not expect that we would get something that's going to be the lowest price, whatever we're buying from that particular retailer. But we would, as I said, once again, that really very high touch. And so we would make decisions that are going to be based on, is that going to deliver the type of experience to our customers that we'd like? Now, somewhere in the middle of those two are what I like to refer to as the target, the best value. And I will tell you right now, that's the hardest one to deploy, because we're always looking at decisions or inputs that we make based on this trade-off between really efficiency, which is, the cost component, versus the effectiveness, the whole service. And we're trying to make that trade-off in those balances where we think it's going to be the most effective. So talk in your teams about what is your approach to the marketplace, because it'll drive a lot of the decision-making on the input side. Now, let me point out something while we're here. We've talked about where you'll start as the forecasting. We have to determine what is our demand going to be because that drives all the other decisions. One of the most important decisions you'll make in month 4 is please name your company if you would, and that comes under the other decisions. Otherwise, when I get the reports back, you'll be known as company question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. And so spend some time, invest in a name that's meaningful, and I think that that will really make sure that you're kind of invested in this simulation as well. We also have research studies that are available as a part of the simulation, and there's quite an array of them. I would say this in terms of a word of advice. We have yet to have a firm that wins the simulation, winning being that they end up with the highest score across those 14 metrics, that does not avail themselves of the research studies. But I will also tell you a very common feedback that I get is that don't buy the research studies, all of them, if you're not going to use them, because it really is not a very good use of your limited funds and resources that you have as a firm. And so think very carefully about someone that might have that role of an analyst in the research studies that you would need so you could make better inputs so that the operational outcomes or the outputs are going to be more of what you would like for them to be. We've already talked about this in terms of the firms being an identical position, and so I'll move past that one as well. I think it's a lot like Bill Gates had said. This is going to be about how you use that information, and I can tell you in all my different avenues of using this course or the simulation, from undergraduate courses to MBAs, to the professional MBAs, to our executive programs, both here at Tennessee as well as the one that I teach at in San Francisco, that is absolutely the determinant. It's not about who is the smartest as it relates to supply chain. This really is about how you deploy your resources as a team and how you use the information that you're given. Let's take a couple of minutes to look at what are the decisions in various decision forms. I talked about a phased-in decision making. We're going to have 3 of those phases just simply because I think learning how the simulation works and all the screens and getting familiar with that, like any other thing, that's the steepest part of the learning curve. And so we found that if we can phase in these distinct portions, that by the time we get to month 6, where we have that ability to change price, we have that ability to use our promotion or advertising dollars, you're really ready to leverage that fully. So in that first month, as I said, we'll start with forecasting. That is the place to start. Once we know what we anticipate that we're going to sell, we will then be able to schedule manufacturing for those products. We'll be able to order not only the raw materials, but to also assure that we have those sub-assemblies that are also a critical part of that. And then you'll be able to make decisions in that month 1 relative to information technology and how you might use things like RFID or synchronize with carriers, etc. In month 5, that's where you'll get a chance to determine what the structure for your supply chain is going to look like. That's where we'll look at distribution. And that's where that schematic of the supply chains for Europe and for the Pacific come into play. Are you going to have a physical presence there? And if you do, are you going to own it and manage it? Or are you going to let a 3PL manage it for you? Transportation is going to be an ongoing one across all of the decisions periods, but distribution is typically a decision that's made once. And unless there are some circumstances that we want to correct for, those tend to be constant throughout the simulation. I've talked about service and generate demand. This is what the decision periods look like. This is already posted on Canvas. We've talked about this a little bit already. I think I'm going to wait until Thursday until we get back to talk about it, because all of your focus now should be on making the month 4 decision, that decision 1, that's going to be the most important one to make sure that we that we're ready to make the best possible decision for that. These are the teams. This is also posted on Canvas, and so we will. I'll move through this one fairly quickly. If you have any question about that team composition, please let me know. We have a lot of decisions to be made, which is why we try to set up our teams in terms of 4 people per team. There's a lot of information and there's a lot of work to be done, and we certainly want to make sure that you have the people and the ability to make those in a timely manner. At this point in time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move through a couple of these slides in terms of this particular presentation, because these are all input forms starting with the forecasting. And I would encourage you to log on to your particular firm in the passcode, check these out, and as I said, you'll see the two products that we're selling here. You see them through the various channels for which we're going to sell them. This is the forms that are related to the forecasting itself. That is absolutely where we will start because it drives a lot of our other decisions. If you look at procurement, you'll see alpha, you'll see the beta that we talked about, and this shows the different suppliers that we can use. And if you look in the manual, you'll see the various costs as well as the service attributes in terms of the quality of those particular vendors and suppliers. You'll also see in terms of those sub-assemblies that we talked about, this is the input screen for those that you'll also need in terms of the procurement. Talking about the manufacturing, please take the time to learn about emergency production as well as that production volume flexibility. As we know, forecasting is not an exact science, and we're going to have a bias that's either going to be we forecast too much or we forecast too little. And we want to make sure that we have designed a manufacturing process that's going to be the most, I would say, efficient as well as effective across the fact that we know we have some error in that forecast already. This talks about the distribution decisions, and as I said, that's a later one that'll happen in the next round or in month 5, and so we'll have some time to address that when we're back together on Thursday in class. Transportation that I talked about before in terms of that decision form itself, and then as we talked about for the various regions, we will also phase in the service decisions themselves. And this is where we get in that final month or in that month 6, we'll have the ability, as I said, the fun really begins when we can change price and we can use some promotion dollars. The IT we've talked about in terms of the various reports, and I would just say once again, I think that you need those because otherwise you're going to be making decisions based on I think, I feel, I believe, and we know that every supply chain manager really needs a good, sound data from which to make really great decisions. And we talked about naming our company as well. This is just a list of the benchmarking studies, and they have various costs that are associated with them. And hopefully you'll see that chapter in the manual and determine which ones will help you make better decisions. I like the simulation. As I said, the only thing that can really be heard in the simulation are some egos. We find that it's an up and down in terms of who's leading and who makes less than fabulous decisions throughout the course of this decision making over the different rounds. We talked about the fact that that last month we're going to have a double run in terms of the simulation, and that's simply going to allow us to make sure that we don't have anybody that's doing in-playing. In other words, that they don't stop manufacturing, that they don't stop ordering parts, that we leave it as an ongoing concern in business itself. We talked about how we assess the performance. There are 14 metrics. They cover 3 different areas. They cover financial measures. You can see those listed here. It also covers operational measures. And then it also covers the customer measures or the satisfaction. Now, each and every time we have a decision round, and it'll run at 9 o'clock, and as I said, about 9:10, 9:15, you'll get an email from the link simulation that says month, in this case, it'll be month 4 decisions are ready. And you'll have a Word document that you'll be able to access through the link simulation site. It looks a lot like an old AS400 in terms of how it comes out, but you'll be given information about not only how you did as a firm across those 14 measures, but you'll also get an indication of where you fall relative to the industry average, the industry best, and also the industry worst. And I would say we want to stay away from this category if we want to improve the performance. So all of those are here. Now, as a links coach or a links facilitator, what I get across those 14, because they have different weights, I get a score for each team for each decision month out of 100 on your performance for that current month as well as for the cumulative period. And so if you look at your 100 points that you're going to get based on your performance, that's the score that I get each time. And so I will also either do a short YouTube video, or I'll do some feedback to you in class about how you're doing and what your ranking is in terms of the best. And that will give you some idea along with your performance dashboard about how you're doing relative to your competitors. As I said, you compete within an industry. We have 2 industries in our particular class. We have 4 companies in each of them. And so each and every decision round, you'll get a performance dashboard that will be under the Excel file there. Please check out that file if you haven't already, because Dr. Chapman has already provided under the forecasting all of the data for the first 3 months, and actually he has a couple of forecasting techniques that if you wanted to, you could certainly avail yourself of. Don't reinvent the wheel. This is about the content and not necessarily how pretty it can be. So when it comes to the mid-cycle review and to that final report, avail yourselves of these particular dashboard components to pull into your presentation and your reports if you need to have them shown. So my suggestions for getting started is this. Please spend the time reading the manual. Also look at your current month's conditions or your operating performance. Most of those reports will contain something on the neighborhood of anywhere from about 12 to about 19 pages, depending on the number of research reports that you've ordered. I think that you have to understand how that simulation works. My advice to you is to have one person at a time do the inputs and check things, because you could very easily cancel out somebody else's input or change in the system if you're not careful. At 9 p.m., you're not going to get a warning that says the simulation is going to run in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds. At 9 o'clock, it'll run. Whatever inputs are in the simulation at that time will be the inputs for which we will be able to determine your month's performance. Likewise, when you're ready to start month 5, you won't start from 0. All you'll need to do is to make changes to those inputs, and many of you choose to make a lot of different changes as you're analyzing where you are and the changes that you need to make in terms of improving your performance. As I said, once again, there's a lot to absorb here. One of the other suggestions that I might make is that I would, in your group or your team, I would have somebody determine what particular decision area that they might want to become the subject matter expert on. And that way they could be the person that if we want to know, for example, how many units can we make per production shift, that person is going to be the one that you would look to that would have that information. There might be someone in terms of procurement that you would also say, what's the discount that we would get if we order alpha and beta in quantities of, let's say, 500,000 each time. And so, as I said, have someone that's going to be familiar with that. And I think that really would be a way to work smarter instead of harder. But ultimately, I think the team as a whole has to understand how this supply chain is operating. I think you have to determine the strategy together. And I think for the first few rounds, I think there has to be a meeting of the minds to determine what to do. The next steps, I can't say this enough, and all the 40 plus times that I've run links, I have yet to see a presentation at the end that didn't say, I wish I had read the manual, not only to start with, but we definitely needed a way to dig into that material to be prepared for the level of decision making that needs. There is a lot of resources on the links website itself, and once again, I provided the website for it here. I know you've gotten a lot of emails from Dr. Chapman, and probably the last thing you want to do is visit that particular website. But he tends to have frequently asked questions, the FAQ. And I find that there, if I search on that, that I'm not the first person that's going to have a question about any of that material. So I would say that's going to be, this is the line of, if you have a question, check the manual, go to the website, check the frequently asked questions. And then I would say you might want to ask somebody else in your group, do you know, for example, what is, the discount that we're going to get? Is it all-inclusive, or is it from a certain quantity forward that we get that discount for ordering those large volumes? And if you still can't find the information, please ask me. I occasionally have a question that I can't answer, but it's much nicer if I send that question to Dr. Chapman, because if you contact him directly, he's going to charge your firm a huge consulting fee. And so I have this workaround that we'll be able to use. Now, I know this was all really fast in terms of walking through the material. I'd hope that Dr. Autry would be able to do this with you, but Dr. Autry has a conflict in the schedule, and so I thought that to move us forward and to have you ready for Thursday's class, that it would be better for me to do this short intro and get you prepared for that links decision. As I said, if you have any questions, then I'll be back, and certainly on Thursday we'll spend a good portion of the class getting ready and spending some team time working on that first decision. I hope you enjoy the link simulation. We're going to be working on this through the rest of the semester. It ends up being one of those things that overall, when we do it, I get a lot of feedback saying that they thought it was probably one of the best elements of the class, and I certainly am hoping that I've structured it for this semester that would be the same for you. I'll see you on Thursday.